if you do have any questions, you can send them through in the Q&A box. However, we will start with some questions that we've already received. I'll get Don to just say hi and welcome himself.
Yeah, thanks, Mick. Thanks for the introduction and welcome to everybody. And as Mikaela said, whatever you want to ask, we will answer it truthfully.
Wonderful. Thank you, Don. We'll start that off. So what sort of materials and resources can I use to improve my vocabulary for the IELTS test?
Well, materials are things that are a lot. They really have to suit you. There's not just one way of preparing, right? There are lots of materials on our website, on our Prepare Hub, the IDP website Prepare. And you'll find practice tests, you'll find tips, you'll find also some videos as well on our YouTube channel as well, on our Facebook page and TikTok. There are lots of there's lots of good advice on those sites, and also you can ask your own questions on those sites too. So there are some of the preparation materials, but if you go into a bookshop that specializes in materials for English language learners, and in every city, anywhere in the world, there is a place like that. If you find something that's published by Cambridge, that would be probably pretty good. There are all those practice tests and things like that, but also textbooks. If you want to increase your vocabulary specifically, there are books out there that say vocabulary for IELTS, right? Vocabulary for IELTS writing and for IELTS speaking. This really just means that here is a collection of words which have a slightly academic flavor, and these are words that are often used. Well, that's good to learn those words, but you've got to learn how to use them. And in order to learn how to use them, you have to really be using English in authentic situations. Now, if you're living in a country like Australia or the US or the UK or Canada or New Zealand, etc., then that's fairly easy. You can find native speakers. But if you're in Vietnam or if you're in another country where there's not a lot of English, then you'll have to rely on YouTube, podcasts, use the internet as much as you can. You might find that you can join a club or something like that where there are English speakers. But the more English you read and hear and use, the better you will develop your vocabulary. Okay? That's my advice.
Wonderful. Thank you, Don. On to the next is, what are the big differences between the academic and the general training IELTS test?
Well, this is a good question. Some people are confused about that. IELTS is unique because it has two different versions of the test, the academic and the general training. Now, the academic is for entry to university, also for registration in professional organisations. The general training is often used for immigration or for non-academic situations, maybe showing your employer your level of English. They are both exactly the same for listening and for speaking. There is no difference. But in the reading and the writing, there is a difference. The reading in the general training is a bunch of shorter texts, the same number of words, but about 5 or 6 shorter texts, which are not really that academic. They're about advertising, about employment, about rules in workplaces, etc. The reading in the academic are 3 only texts of about 900 words each that are a little bit more academic. Not very academic, but talking about a serious issue. in the writing, the academic task 2 and the general training task 2 are very similar. You have to give your opinion in 250 words, but the task 1 is very different. Academic task 1, describe some visual information, a graph, maps, floor plans, table of figures, etc. In general training task 1, write a letter, maybe a formal letter, maybe an informal letter. And they're the differences. And the assessment criteria are much the same for the writing in both academic and general training. And the way that the tests are marked is the same.
Thank you very much, Don. Now, you were referring to task 2 and task 1 there, so I will go through to our very live question that we have here, is how can I extend ideas in task 2?
Okay, this is an important thing. If you look at the public version of the assessment criteria for task 2, you'll see at band 7, it says presents, and this is the first criterion, task response. It says presents, extends, and supports main ideas. Maybe that you overgeneralize, but you support your ideas in some way, and you have more than one idea. So this is important if you want to get 7, 8, and 9 for that criterion, task response. So how do you extend your ideas? How do you come up with ideas? How do you brainstorm? This is a skill that you can develop, and you can develop it by doing it every day. Think about an issue. It might be education. You can ask yourself an issue about something that in your country. How can primary schools be improved in your country? Or maybe something like education is expensive. Should the government pay the fees for students? Well, think of as many ideas as you can. It's to use that last example. Well, if the government pays the fees, then poorer people will get a better education. If there are fees, then the richer people will get a better education. The more that the government spends on education, the less it can spend on health and other things. So that's a disadvantage. You might say that there should be a mix of people paying fees and other people not paying fees. That's just one way, in 1 minute, coming up with about 4 ideas on that subject. Now, that's a skill that you can develop every day by asking yourself some questions. And once you've asked those questions, then you can go to Google and ask a question. You could ask this question: should the government pay school fees? Or should education be free? And once you start typing a question into Google, you know what happens. You get a whole list of people who have already asked that question. And you are sent to various places where people have answered that question. Now, all of those answers are really, in many cases, very good task 2 essays or very good answers in an IELTS speaking test. So immediately you're getting a lot of information. Then talk to your friends about it. Think about the issues, talk to your friends, do a bit of research. And by the time you come to the IELTS test, then you will have the skill to develop your own ideas and to support them. I hope.
Fantastic advice, Don. On to our next question is, how do raw band scores convert into band scores that I am given?
Yes, well, that's a very good question. The conversion of a raw band score to an IELTS score, there is a table if you go to our website, the IELTS Prepare website. But as a rough guide, in an academic reading test, if you get 30 correct answers, that will be about a band 7. And the reason I say about is simply because Cambridge, who designs each test, knows if one test is maybe a little bit more difficult or a little bit easier than another test. That means they have a statistical basis for saying, well, this test has some more difficult questions. Therefore, you only need to get 29 correct answers for a 7 with this test. But for this test, you need to get 31 correct answers for a band 7. So Cambridge tries, in fact, they succeed in making each test equal. Even though one test might be a little bit more difficult, the band score will be correct. So a band 7, about 30 answers correct in academic reading. But in general training reading, you'll need to get a few more correct answers because the general training reading is a little bit easier for many people. That's reading. For listening, it's much the same. You get a raw score and you get a conversion to a band score. But look at our website and you will see a conversion table that will go down from 7, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, etc. Off the top of my head, I can't remember the exact conversion for every raw score at the moment. One last thing, some people think that if you do the IELTS test in a country where people speak very good English, you will get a lower score because you are being compared with some very good users of English. And if you do the test in a country where people don't speak much English, you'll get a higher score. This is completely wrong. The score you get would be exactly the same no matter where you do the test, okay? The test is not standardized in that way. That's all I'm going to say about it, Mikaela.
It's quite fascinating, and it's a great way to explain it, to kind of step it out and do how the listening and the reading, like it's not exactly equal for both of them, but it is, obviously you do get that same band score.
Yes.
So moving on is, for the first part of the question, is there a set word limit for the writing test for task 1 and task 2? And is there a limit on how many pieces of paper I'm allowed during the test to be writing on?
No, there is not a limit. You can write as many words as you like. You can use as many pieces of paper as you like. So if you're doing the paper and pencil test, you simply put up your hand and ask for some more, another booklet to write in. I have seen some essays in task 2 that cover about 4 pages, maybe 5. But this is not a good idea. If you write about 500 words instead of 250 in task 2, then imagine you're doubling your chances of making mistakes, spelling mistakes, punctuation mistakes, grammatical mistakes, paragraphing. You're also probably not focusing on answering the question as well and as efficiently and as clearly as you can. So focus on that. How can I answer this question clearly? And remember, when you are answering a question in academic or general training task 2, look at the question very carefully, because there might be one part you have to answer, there might be 2 things you have to talk about, there might even be 3 or 4 things that you are asked to discuss. So do that. That's critically important. So the examiner will read everything you write, but I recommend that you try and stick to about 270 words maximum for task 2 and about 170 words maximum for task 1.
Thank you very much, Don. Now, continuing on with the writing questions is, can you tell me the difference between fully addressed, sufficiently addressed, and adequately addressed?
That's a very good question. And I love to see that one of our questioners has actually looked at the assessment criteria, because they are quoting the first criterion, which is task response. And at band 9, a person who gets a band 9 for that criterion, task response, which is 25% of the mark, they fully address all parts of the task. And at band 8, they sufficiently address all parts of the task. And at band 7, they address all parts of the task. And at band 6, they address all parts of the task, although some parts might be addressed better than other parts. And at band 5, they don't address all parts. So IELTS uses these words, usually adverbs, fully, sufficiently, in order to distinguish levels. Now, fully means that the examiner looks at this essay and says, I can't think of anything more that this person could write. They have covered everything. They have given evidence for everything that they have said. They haven't missed out any part of the question. At a band 8, it's sufficient. It's a good answer. It's a very good answer. But maybe they could have given a bit more evidence for that thing that they said. And at a band 7, well, they've looked at this and this and this and this, but maybe the evidence is not maybe it's a bit too general. Maybe it's not focused enough. Maybe there's not quite enough support for this idea. And at band 6, the examiner will say, well, yeah, this part is addressed. It's quite well addressed. But they only mention this other part, and they don't really say much about it. And for a band 5, the examiner will say, well, they have looked at this, but they never even said a word about this part of the question. And that's the difference.
Thank you, Don. And I'll continue on with the writing questions. So our next one is, I'm having difficulty finishing the writing task 1 within the time limit. Do you have any tips for writing faster, as I'm aiming to achieve a band 7?
Writing faster is, well, look, there are several issues here. First issue is, have you planned your essay a little bit? Do you know what you are going to write? Now, planning an essay is a skill. We were talking earlier on about brainstorming, getting a lot of ideas, and then putting them into a sequence, putting them into a pattern or into a logical form. That's essay planning. And you should practice doing that and try and do it in about 2 minutes. Now, if you do that, you'll be able to write more quickly, because you'll know what you're going to write. And you'll know that, okay, I'm covering this, and the next thing, I know what I'm going to say in the next paragraph and the next paragraph. So that's one way of improving your speed. But there is another important point, and that is maybe you are just a slow writer. And if you are that person, relax. You still have enough time to write, and you will probably write quite carefully, and you won't make too many spelling mistakes writing slowly. If you are a person who writes very quickly, actually writes, your orthography is quick, that means your handwriting, then be very careful, because you might make a few little spelling errors, or maybe your letters might not be clear. So be careful about that. Remember, if your word is not written clearly, then the examiner may say that is a spelling mistake, or I don't understand that word, and that will affect your coherence. If you are good at typing, I suggest you do the computer delivered test. If that is in your city, then remember, the computer delivered test will help you write probably more quickly if you are good at a keyboard, and it will also tell you how many words you have written. Practice makes perfect. So set yourself a task. Say, okay, I'm going to write 150 words in 15 minutes, including planning and including checking. That would be one way that you could improve your speed. And apart from that, I can't think of anything else to say.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Don, for that reply. Our next one is to do with the listening and the reading. If I misspell a word in the listening or reading, will I receive a 0 or will I get some sort of score?
You won't be marked correct. In the listening and the reading, if it's a question where you have to supply a word, for example, finish this sentence or label this diagram, then your spelling must be correct. Otherwise, it will be marked wrong. And remember what I just said about writing quickly. If your handwriting is unclear, if it can't be read properly, then that will be marked wrong as well. So I would recommend that you use block letters to write your answer if your handwriting is not clear. And remember to check your spelling for those sorts of questions, because spelling counts in listening, in reading, and of course in writing.
Thank you, Don. That's great advice. Another question about the listening is there time to read the questions before the audio is played in the listening test?
Yes, there is. And the recording will tell you. The recording will say, now you have some time to look at questions 5 to 10. And they will give you some time. They'll give you about 20 seconds, I think. And when you do that, you must do it efficiently. Practice looking for keywords. Understand the situation. Try and predict what sort of answer you need to supply. It might be a number. It might be a date. It might be a person's name. So the more you're able to predict, the more you're able to find a key word that you're listening for, or probably a word that is very similar to that key word, then that is very good preparation for when the recording starts. So again, this is something you can practice. Some people, when they're given time to look at the questions, go back and look at their previous answers. Don't do that. Use that time to analyze the questions and to predict what the answers will be.
Thank you, Don. We've got a live question that's come in. It says, how can I support an argument in the writing test? Do I need exact research evidence or evidence from my own personal experiences?
That's a good question. Some people think that the IELTS essay is like an essay you would write for your university lecturer. It is not. It is different. And in fact, you are told in the writing test to support your position with evidence from your own experience, from your own knowledge and experience. That means you can say, maybe we'll go back to our earlier example talking about education. You can say something like, when I went to university, it was free. In fact, that's true many years ago. And that was good because it gave everybody a chance to study. That's perfectly good in IELTS because that's all you have to do. I have supported my opinion with some evidence from my experience. So don't worry about saying there was a survey in the New York Times in 2018 which suggested, because really it may be true, you can do that, but you don't have to make it up. You don't have to pretend that you have that evidence, okay?
Thank you, Don. Now back to the questions that we've been asked earlier this evening is, do you have any advice on how I can focus my mind during the test to help me worry less?
Right. Well, there's one secret. Listen, let me tell you a story. Many, many years ago when I was 18, and that's probably back very early in the dim, dark days of the world, I failed my driving test 3 times. The first 2 times I failed it. No, sorry, I only failed it twice, and I passed on the 3rd time. The first 2 times I failed it was because I was very nervous, and I left it for a while. The 3rd time I did it, I passed because I was not nervous. Why? How can that be? Well, I was a little bit older, but not much older. The reason I was not nervous was because I had prepared sufficiently well. And I knew that I had done the preparation and there was nothing more I could do to prepare. I made sure I had a good night's sleep the night before and plenty to eat. And I was fairly relaxed. So the same principle really applies in many ways to every test. If you do enough preparation, by the time you get to the test, there's nothing more you can do except relax. You're not going to improve your performance by worrying, and there's no need to worry because you have done sufficient preparation. And you know that you have had enough sleep, you know that you have your bottle of water there if you want it. You know that the world is not going to end if you don't get the score you want, and so you will perform at the best. These are very obvious things, and I know that everyone is different, but that's the best I can offer, Mick, I'm afraid.
No, that is great advice, Don. On to our next question is, will I be penalised in the IELTS speaking test for using incorrect grammar or slang the way a native speaker might use it?
There are different types of native speaker. I am a native speaker, and so is Mick. And we generally don't swear, except if I'm in a particular type of situation. Now, remember, the speaking test is a fairly formal situation. You're talking to a complete stranger to begin with, and this complete stranger is someone who is assessing you. Now, they're not assessing you on your manners. They're not assessing your clothing. They're not looking at your hairstyle or your body language, but they are looking at your language only. In some countries, Australia is one of them, we are very relaxed about casual speech, and there is a high level of tolerance for quite informal speech. But if you're doing the test somewhere else, maybe in the UK, maybe in India, it could be very different. So be careful about that. Where are you doing the test? And the other thing I'd say about slang is that some slang is perfectly okay, but other slang is a little bit offensive. So don't use that slang. And finally, idiomatic language, which is slang, is the most difficult language to use, because idiomatic means these are words that are used with a special meaning and in a special order and in a particular context only. And you have to know all of those things in order to use them correctly. Okay? Some phrases, idiomatic phrases, are only used in the negative. Some are only used as a criticism. So you don't want to use them, one as in the positive or as a form of admiration for somebody. So these are quite difficult things to understand. So I would recommend stay away from slang if you can, unless you are certain of how to use it. Okay?
Thank you, Don. We've got a couple of live questions coming in, so I'll refer to those for the moment. In the listening test, if 3 words are allowed, I put an ice pack instead of ice pack. Since ice pack is the correct answer, will I lose a mark?
And 3 words are permitted? Then that would be fine because you've written 3 words. It's a good question because I am not certain of the answer, that whether an article or that is whether they allow that or not. It can depend on the context, on the context. For example, if you are completing a sentence and that "and" is not grammatical, right? For example, there are many ... and you said an ice pack. Well, that would be wrong because that would not finish the sentence correctly, right? It would have to be ice packs. Sometimes words can be hyphenated. Ice pack probably can be hyphenated as well, which makes it 1 word. I would always just be careful not to include an extra word, even if it is a or the, and stick to the limit, okay? So always stick to the limit and be careful if the word is being put in a sentence that it is grammatical, that it fits the grammar of the sentence, and also check the spelling of the word as well.
Thank you, Don. Next question is, as I understand, the most important thing in the listening test is to not lose concentration while the recording is being played. I would like to know your views on whether you agree with that.
I do agree with it. Well, it's a very important thing. The most important thing is probably to have a level of English where you can recognize words and recognize when they're put together, recognize the meaning. But in order to do that, you need to maintain your concentration. And there are some ways that you can help yourself do that. I've already mentioned one, and that is you are as relaxed as you can be. And that means you come to the test with plenty of time. The night before, you had plenty of sleep. You had a good breakfast. You didn't rush to come to the test. You are sitting down. You know that you have prepared yourself. You've had a bit of practice listening to different forms of English. A couple of people having a conversation, maybe recorded information, people giving a lecture. And we help you by making sure that the answers come in the same order as the questions. So in other words, you're listening for the answer to question 22, and you know it's a number, right? Because you've just looked at the question. And you've also had a look at the answer at the question 23, which is a name, apparently, according to my imagination. You know that you're going to hear the number before you hear the name, because the answer to the question 21 will come before the answer to question 22. So that helps you keep focused, okay? So if you do hear the name, the answer to the second question, and you forgot you didn't catch the earlier answer, relax. It's gone. There's nothing you can do about that. Now you focus on questions 23 and 24. So maybe that will help you focus as well.
Thank you, Don. Now back to writing. So in the writing test, is task 2 harder than task 1, or does it just require more words?
It really depends on the person. Some people think that task 1 is harder than task 2. Some people think that task 2 is harder than task 1. For obvious reasons. You might be an accountant, for example, and you've done a science degree or something like that, and you love looking at graphs and looking at tables of figures. You understand it very well, and you know the language to describe that. The profits for this company improved dramatically over a 10-year period, while the profits for that company were stable. Now, our accountant will find that fairly simple. But if you studied fine art or something, you might find that a rather more difficult task. Some people find it difficult to express an opinion on a topic. What is your opinion about an appropriate punishment for theft? I don't know. What is your opinion about what the government should do about global warming? No idea, right? Another person might have a lot of ideas about these things. So the point is, some people will find task 1 more difficult. Some people will find task 2 more difficult. Some people will want to do task 2 first and then do task 1. That's okay. It's up to you. But try and spend no more than 20 minutes on task 1, no more than 40 minutes on task 2, because task 2 is twice the value of task 1. Okay, that's an important piece of information. So if you get your 7 in task 1 and only a 6 in task 2, your score will not be a 7 overall. It will come down to a 6.5.
Thank you very much for that explanation, Don. Now, this person has a week to study before their test, and they would like to know what they should focus their studies on.
A week, well, they should think about their strong points and their weak points. They should know this, or they should have an idea about it. And it may be that their listening is not very good. Well, do a lot of listening. They may know that their spelling is not very good. So practice some of those words that they misspell. It may be that they need to listen to a lot more English and try and imitate the accent that they hear, to imitate the pronunciation of English, because their pronunciation is not so good. Well, practice those words that they have difficulty with. But in 1 week, remember, there's not much you can do. So this is good. It's like what I said before. There's not much you can do except that word beginning with R, Mick, relax. So you should say, okay, I've only got a week. There's nothing really much that I can do except read and listen to as much English as I can and relax.
Wonderful. Thank you, Don. And kind of on that topic is, instead of having a week before the test, someone would like to know, how long should you actually study before you sit the test for the first time?
Well, there is study and study. I am at the age of, I am still studying, and I'm still learning English, right? So in fact, you should always be studying. You should always be improving your English. And that is something that should never stop. But studying for the test, in other words, preparing or understanding the structure of the test, being able to identify different types of questions and have strategies for answering those questions, and understanding the assessment criteria, for example, then that is something that really you can understand all of that, I think, in about a week. If you look at a couple of practice tests, you will see, okay, this is the format. I understand that type of question. This is the way that a reading passage is structured in IELTS. I understand that. I can see this is the sort of thing that I have to write in task 1, and this is the sort of thing I have to write in task 2. And when you do your practice tests, I recommend, don't say, I'm going to do 10 practice tests this week. Just do a couple. and really analyze one test and write an essay for that test, but then correct that essay and rewrite, make it better. Look at the reading passages and understand the way that the reading passages work. Try and learn some language from that. So I would always recommend less is more. This is a very nice English idiom, which is probably in all languages, but spend a lot of time on a few practice tests rather than a little bit of time on a lot of practice tests.
Definitely. Thank you, Don. We've got quite a few to go, and I know we've got 20 minutes, so we'll keep going through them. Is the speaking examiner the only examiner that marks my test? So when you do the test with the speaking examiner, is that the only examiner, or is there someone else that marks it as well?
Generally speaking, that person is the only person who gives you a score. So the speaking examiner, the person who speaks to you in the speaking test, is also the person who gives you the score. And they will write down your score when you leave the room. They will look at the assessment criteria and they will give you a score for your fluency and coherence. Were you able to keep going? They'll give you a score for your lexical resource. Were you able to use a variety of words appropriately? They'll give you a score for your grammar. Were you able to make a few errors, but not too many in your grammar? And did you use a range of grammar? And finally, they'll give you a score for your pronunciation. Did they understand everything that you said? And were you able to produce the natural rhythm of English? They are the main features of the assessment. But if this speaking examiner has given you a score that is lower, quite a bit lower than your scores for reading and listening, or if they've given you a score which is quite a bit higher than your scores for listening and reading, another examiner will listen to the recording. That's why we record every speaking test. And this examiner, this second examiner, will give a score for those 4 criteria as well. And then the computer, a very big computer, a huge computer, will figure out what score you should have finally. And if you think that's rubbish, I'm not a 6, I'm an 8, then you can go to your test center and say, I want an inquiry on results. And you'll have to pay a small amount of money, but then a third examiner will listen to that recording, and that examiner's score will be the score that is given to you. Okay?
And just in saying that, of course, the score will never decrease in value. In the remark, if you do get it remarked, your score will either remain or increase.
Very good point. And can I just add one more thing? Those 3 examiners don't know each other, and they don't know you. So the first examiner doesn't know you. Oh, well, they know you. They've met you because they give you the score, but they don't know why you're doing the test. They don't know anything about your ambitions or anything. The second examiner knows nothing about you, and the third examiner knows nothing about you as well.
Wonderful. Thank you, Don. Our next question is, my students have asked me if there's a new pattern in the way IELTS is marked. Is there a way that I can keep up to date with the changes of the IELTS test?
The IELTS marking methodology has not changed. And if it does change, then it will be advertised. But really, the assessment of speaking and writing has really been very consistent over the last, I can't remember, 15 years probably. The way that listening and reading are marked has not changed either. So the types of a person who did the test 10 years ago, the way they were marked is exactly how you will be marked now.
Thank you, Don. Next is, almost read out the same question. I'm a year 11 student and I'm soon to be sitting the IELTS test for the first time. how can I start my study? Now, I know you've gone over this quite a few times, but maybe you could just give like a brief recap.
Yep. So how do you start your study? Well, I would try and figure out, first of all, I would first understand the test, okay? And there are many ways to understand the test. I think a good way to understand the test is simply to go to our website, and the test is described there. And then do a practice test. And from that practice test, you will get a fairly clear indication of where you need to improve. Now, when you do a practice test, you don't get a score, of course, for your writing. You can figure out a score for your listening and reading by looking at the answer key. So maybe you should also consider doing the IELTS progress check, which is something you can do online, and you will get a score and feedback as to your performance. That's something that is much cheaper than doing the real test, and the feedback will say, well, you are about a band 6 for writing. You're about a band 5.5 for speaking. You are a band 8 for reading. They will give you these scores, not official scores, but they are scores that can help you understand where you are strong and where you need to improve. So do all of those things. And as a year 11 student, you have a great resource. You have a teacher there. And I would do a practice writing test and give it to your teacher and say, well, what do you think? How can I improve this? And they, if they're a good teacher, and I'm sure they are, will tell you.
Thank you, John. Another live question over here. I really like this question. So in the speaking test, is the examiner looking for strong argument and persuasiveness or fluency of the language? Should I treat it as a casual chat or a job interview?
I would not worry too much about supporting your ideas with the same rigor, with the same solidity or strength as you would an argument in the written test, because the speaking test does not really have a criterion called task achievement or task response. The assessment in speaking, what the examiner is listening for is fluency and coherence. In other words, is it logical? Do I understand what you're saying? Looking for lexical resource, the words you're using, grammatical range and accuracy, the accuracy of your grammar, and your pronunciation. So here, it's in part a bit like a job interview, but in other parts, it's like a casual conversation, because the test has 3 parts. And the first part is pretty casual, but it's a bit like a job interview because it's question, answer, question, answer. And the questions are fairly simple about your personal life. What do you like? What do you do? Where do you go on the weekend, etc. What's your favorite food, for example? Then in the second part, you are tested on your ability to continue to speak for 2 minutes on a simple topic, talking about a person, talking about a place, talking about an object, talking about an event. Practice that. And the third part is where you are asked to discuss something. And this might be a little bit more like some sorts of job interviews, but it's not too formal. You can say, well, I don't really know very much about that, but I suppose blah, blah, blah. That's okay, as long as you use good English.
Thank you, John. Our next question is, how important is tone and varying pitch in the speaking test, and what criteria will that affect?
There are 2 questions here, tone and varying pitch. So tone, really, I'm assuming that this person is asking about the level of formality or informality, because that's normally what we think of as tone. And as I said before, it's a semi-formal experience, but it's not very formal. You don't have to be particularly formal when you're talking to the examiner. But as I said, don't use too much slang. The question of pitch, of course, is a question of pronunciation. Are you using your voice in a natural way? Now, this is important because it's one of the criteria in speaking. If you look at the assessment criteria for speaking under pronunciation, it says uses a wide range of pronunciation features. What are pronunciation features? They are intonation. They are using your voice to express meaning, just like I did then, right? It's using stress. It's important to do that. It's stress. It's being able to join words that don't normally do join together. You know, I had a good time, good time. It's being able to maintain the rhythm of your performance, of your pronunciation in sensible chunks. Instead of saying, I went to the zoo on Sunday, you say, I went to the zoo on Sunday. You see that I chunked the first part together and the last part together. So all of those, that's pronunciation features. So practice doing that. And that is partly pitch, intonation, and the formality is, I presume, tone. There may be questions there which I've misunderstood. Maybe it's about accent. Accent is okay as long as it's understood. So if you have a Brazilian accent or a Japanese accent or a Chinese accent, fine. But practice those sounds that can be confusing, okay?
Thank you, Don. I know we've got 7 minutes left. We've got quite a few questions, but we won't be able to get through all of them. However, we will go to the next one, which is how many typos can you make in the test in terms of being penalised? Like, will it have a big impact on you?
Yeah, because a typo will be considered as a spelling mistake. And this is the sort of thing that might happen when you're doing the computer-delivered test. If your fat fingers maybe don't hit the right key. So it's very crucial for you to spend a couple of minutes proofreading what you have written to check for typos like that. Of course, if it's a typo, like if you've written T-H-E, 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 and at one point you say T-E, well, that's okay. The examiner will say, well, that is a typo. But other types of typos will be treated as a spelling mistake. So if you look at the assessment criteria for writing, you'll see under lexical resource, the third criterion, it says at band 5, makes noticeable errors in spelling. At band 6, makes some errors in spelling. At band 7, it says occasional errors in spelling. At band 8, rare errors in spelling. And at band 9, no errors in spelling.
Thank you, John. Another question we have here is, in my first try, I got an 8.5 in both listening and reading and only a 6.5 in speaking and writing. I need a 7 in each component. Should I now only focus on practicing reading and speaking instead of listening and, should I now only focus on studying the writing and the speaking since that's the scores I did lower, or should they continue to?
Well, I think that would probably be wise, because speaking and writing are clearly, they are the productive skills. And this is where you can make more mistakes for obvious reasons, because when you're reading or listening, you don't have to be able to spell a word to understand the word, right? But in writing, you do. You don't need to be able to pronounce the word when you're reading the word, but in speaking, you do. So what you should do is talk to a native speaker, talk to your teacher, do the progress check, which I recommended a little bit earlier on. You can find that on our website. And focus on the sorts of errors that you're making in speaking and in writing. Because it might not be all of your writing, it might be a spelling problem. In your speaking, it might be a pronunciation problem. It might be a grammar problem in both of them. Find out exactly where you're making those mistakes and focus on that hard and make sure that you try and improve those things. But it's really important that you focus on exactly what it is you're doing wrong. And as I said, the progress check would help, but we also have a writing assist, which is something that will give you some advice about focusing on your errors. And also you can get some speaking advice in some countries, probably not all countries at the moment. But if you have a teacher or a native speaking friend, ask them. Say, where am I going wrong?
Thank you, Don. We've got 3 minutes. I might do 1 or 2 questions more.
Okay.
I'll go with this one. If someone gets a low score in one component of the test, and like a higher score in the other 3, do they need to repeat the whole test, or can they just repeat that one component that they got the low score?
They have to repeat the whole test. Although I believe there are some, I don't know if I should say this, but there are some people who want to be able to do that, and there might be something happening in the future. Who knows? But currently, as far as I know, Mick, you know this better than me, you have to do the whole test again, correct?
Yes, that is correct. In the terms and conditions, it does say that in order for the results to be released, you must see all 4 components of the test.
Yep.
So,
for some purposes, though, I know that there are some receiving organisations like the Nursing Board in New Zealand or some places like that who will say, give us your 2 best performances in a test. So it might be worth asking if you're doing the test for professional registration or for some sort of other purpose, say, can I give you my 2 best tests, and you can look at those.
Yeah, definitely. It's always worth asking. Like, you never know until you ask. So it's always a great way to do it. We'll wrap it up with one more question. I am working professionally as a teacher. Can you suggest if I should be sitting academic or general training?
So this person is working currently as a teacher.
Yes.
And the purpose for doing IELTS, I'm presuming, would be for not for professional registration because they already are registered as a teacher, but for immigration purposes maybe, or entry into a university. I'm not sure. Basically, it's a good question because it really doesn't matter what you're doing, what job you're doing. It's a matter of where do you feel most comfortable. And if you are a teacher, then I suspect you are quite familiar with reading serious passages of written English of some length. That would be suitable, a suitable skill for the academic reading. If you are comfortable with describing graphic information like tables and charts, then that would be suitable for the academic writing. But if you're not comfortable with those things, then I would suggest you do the general training. But again, look at the academic practice test, look at the general training practice test, and think, which one am I going to do better at? But do remember that in the reading, you need to get a higher raw score to get the same equivalent band score that you would get in the academic reading. I hope that's clear.
Yes, wonderful. Thank you so much, Don. It's been a great session. And I'd like to thank everyone for your questions. I know we weren't able to get through all of them. Obviously, if you do have any more questions, you can jump onto our new Facebook page, which is IELTS Prepare at IDP Facebook group. The page is made with lots of preparation materials, and for you to write your questions, and obviously someone can get back to you with answers, and you can also discuss with other people on the page about your IELTS related questions. So it's been a fantastic session. Thank you once again, Don. You always have the information and knowledge that is needed to answer these questions.
I hope.
Yes, always.
And thank you, Mick. It's always a pleasure working with you.
It is always a pleasure. So thank you, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your evening, day, wherever you are in the world, and wishing you all the best with your IELTS.
Okay, same from me. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.